So we're recording. So hey guys, great to have you along, and you know this is actually a real honour for us to have Garry with us. For those of you who know Garry, I'll just do a very brief introduction. But Professor Garry Egger, look, it's not overstating it to say that Garry would be considered, one of the fathers of lifestyle medicine here in Australia. Garry, you like the fact that I said father, not grandfather?
Grandfather's.
But Garry, look, is just, to be honest, and look, I don't want to get all soppy on Garry right now because I don't want him tearing up or anything like that. But look, Garry is a character. If you meet him, the first time I ever bumped into him, I thought this guy is a world changer, and he's got an incredible mind. He's got accolades all over the place. And he's always looking for the next thing. And so lifestyle medicine was something that he decided was going to be that some time back, and is dedicated. And really, not only is he a visionary in what he sees needs to happen in the world, but he has an incredible capacity to make it happen too. And so, look, he's author over 30 books. I think he's got about 160. What's that?
I lost you there for a minute. Back on there.
I was saying good stuff, I promise you. I think he's got over 160, 170 odd publications in academic journals. He's worked for the World Health Organization. He's won an Order of Australia medal for his contribution to medical education and health promotion here in Australia. So he is an absolute legend. Garry, do you know what? You might not like me saying this, but he's actually been quite a mentor to me. And so I blame him for all of my failings. And Garry also has been an incredible support for this course. In fact, he was right there at the start when we wanted to develop this course. He was in the original group and lended his wisdom to it. And then even along the way, he's been a great support, even so much as being on the reaccreditation panel that we've been going through, which has been heaps of fun. So yeah, look, Garry really is an Australian icon in this space. And so Garry, it's a real privilege for us to have you with us, sharing with us. Just to give you some perspective, and I told you a bit of the backstory, but this particular unit we're doing is called Lifestyle Medicine, Past, Present, Future. And we've been looking at, what is lifestyle medicine. We did a bit of a SWOT analysis on lifestyle medicine. And in this particular module, we're looking at essentially what are the elements of lifestyle medicine. And Gary's actually, one other thing he's done, he likes to invent words. So I understand that obesogenic is one of your words. Is that correct?
Well, it was really Boyd Swinburne's and mine. Yeah, 1996, the British Medical Journal.
But you can take credit for it because Boyd's not here.
Well,
so,
half credit, 50% credit. Yeah.
And then one of the other words that he's invented, and we've got some readings on this, is this notion of anthropogens. So hopefully we're talking debriefing a little bit on that. So they're all familiar with your nasty malodors, which I understand we were chatting earlier in the week, and it's now nasty malice odours, is it?
Yeah, nasty odours with malice.
With malice, there we go. All right, so
yeah.
At this stage, Garry, I'm happy to hand it over to you, mate.
Okay, so I just go into share, do I?
Yep, that's correct, just like we did before.
All right, we should, for everybody, oh, hang on, where are we? Here. Is that right? Everybody see that?
Yep.
So just to, for everybody's planning, I'll probably take about half an hour. I hope I've got about 16 slides, and I'm going to skip through this one aspect of lifestyle medicine, only a very small aspect, but hopefully I can stimulate you to become interested in it and to want to follow it further on, because we need more and more good people in this area at the moment. So, and it really comes out of, hang on, can I forward advance it? It comes out of this notion that up until about the 1960s, at least certainly in the 70s when I got involved in lifestyle medicine or in health promotion, we were dealing with acute diseases and infectious diseases, and we had pretty well got a good hold on them through hygiene, sanitation, water and microorganisms. Don't let anybody tell you that it was medicine that cured the acute disease epidemic that we had back in those days, because it was solved more by hygiene and pasteurisation and these other things before that was back in the 1850s, before the 1930s, with the invention of sulfonamides and penicillin. Of course, we've got a little bit of a problem because we've got this tick at the end now. We don't know where infectious diseases are going, but the infectious diseases that we've got at the moment are largely coming from lifestyle-based causes. They come out of China and Mexico and Saudi Arabia and so on, where people are living on top of each other and living with animals. So it's all still lifestyle-based. So lifestyle medicine covers that whole lot. What's happened now, though, is, of course, we've got this rise in chronic diseases. So this little point here is called the epidemiological transition. That's where countries develop well enough that they've been able to get hold of their acute diseases, but to replace those, you get these chronic diseases. And I'll just talk about what they are in a minute, chronic diseases, but they're caused by lifestyle, the environment, and particularly economic development and political situations. And you can't avoid politics when you're dealing with health at this level, particularly in this day and age. So we've really got two categories of disease here. We've got infectious diseases on the left here, and infectious diseases really started to be dealt with very well with the invention of the germ theory. And the germ theory didn't actually come out until the 1930s with the development of the penicillins and sulfonamides and so on. But by defining all germs, it did come out earlier than that, because we knew back in the 1700s by the Dutch guy, Van der Hout, I think his name was, who invented the microscope. Correct me, Darren. Remember his name?
Sounds about right. Yep.
That he could see little things under the microscope, and these little things they came to realise were actually microorganisms. They weren't just weird things carried in the air. And so we developed this germ theory where we were attacking not just one set of microbes, but all microbes that were classified under this monocausal basis of germ theory. So having one word and one singular approach to dealing with infectious diseases, we were able to use hygiene and public health, and then antibiotics and immunisation to deal with those. When chronic diseases started to become more prevalent back in the 1960s and 70s, and more so in the 80s, it was actually 1980 when chronic diseases took over in Western cultures from infectious disease as the main cause of disease. We didn't have any of this. We didn't have a single word for it. We didn't have a single monocausal focus. And so we're dealing with chronic diseases in silos. And those silos for things like heart disease and musculoskeletal problems and cancers and so on. And we didn't have one singular way of dealing with these. And it's only now that we're starting to get to this. And before I do that, I'll just look at the chronic disease categories. So all these things like cardio and cerebrovascular diseases, cancers with lifestyle components, endocrine metabolic disorders. If you look under the diseases in the HIW, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, you'll see all these classifications. The 10 most prevalent chronic diseases these days add up to about 70 to 75% of all appearances to a doctor, to primary care these days. Infectious diseases have gone down. And there's no doubt that medicine was fantastic with infectious diseases, but we developed this sort of notion that if you got sick, you went to the doctor and you were given a pill or medicine. And that worked for many years. Back in the 60s, it worked brilliantly. And we designed our medical system here in Australia around that, so that the MBS was designed to pay people, to pay doctors for quick treatments that they dealt with through medicine. Unfortunately, one of the outcomes of all that was that people developed this notion of the magic bullet, that all you had to do was go to a doctor and you'd get a pill, and that pill would solve your problem. But of course, it doesn't work in chronic diseases. And when the infectious diseases, when we got hold of the infectious diseases and chronic diseases started to rise, largely because of the increased aging of the population, but also because of our lifestyles, then we weren't able to deal with these. And we still aren't able to deal with them, in particular with medicines, even though the pharmaceutical companies would like to think that we can, because the medicines that they use now for chronic diseases are much more profitable than the medicines that we use for infectious diseases. You're probably aware that antibiotics now are not being well researched. We're getting to the end of the antibiotic era, and pharmaceutical companies aren't really very interested in coming up with new antibiotics, because you only use them for 5 or 10 days, and they make one sale on it, and that's it. Whereas with chronic diseases, if you're dealing with things like cholesterol and blood pressure and so on, you'll be taking a medication for the rest of your life. So that's an enormous profit saving for drug companies to be able to do that. So this thing called lifestyle medicine cropped up. I first became involved in about 2006, I think it was. We realised that health promotion wasn't working because the doctors weren't using it very much. They were handing it over to everybody else. And health promotion was initially a form of health education. It was then changed in the 80s to health promotion because it included things other than just education. And that didn't work very well, but we, a fellow doctor up on the north coast of New South Wales, Andrew Binns, and myself, out walking one morning, we said, look, there's a word, lifestyle medicine, that seems to resonate with doctors because it's got the medicine involved in it, but it's also got the lifestyle involved. Why don't we give that a bit of a try? And about the same time as we did that, the Americans did it. They came up with the American Society, I think it is. Darren?
American College of Lifestyle Medicine.
American College of Lifestyle Medicine, that's right, yeah. And we came up with the Australian Lifestyle Medicine Association, which was ALMA, which we've since changed because we kept getting confused with the Australian Lesbian Medical Association and the Australian Lawnmowers Association. So we changed it to the Australian Society of Lifestyle Medicine, which it now is. And so if you want to look up more on that, you look up just lifestylemedicine.org.au on the internet. And I'd suggest you do if you're interested in this area, because they've got lots of good things going on there at the moment. I'm at the age now where I'm able to sit back and watch this go on and hand it on to younger pundits like Darren Morton and lots of other young guys that are coming through and have got the keenness to carry this on. And I've got at least the satisfaction of knowing that I was involved in this at the start. I'm struggling to keep up with it all now. We did write the textbook in lifestyle medicine. We were the second in the world. The Americans had one in 1999. But it really covered more general medicine. So it looked at sports medicine and women's medicine and things like that rather than lifestyle-based medicine. This first issue over here, 2008, was a pretty general issue in lifestyle medicine. 2011, we added some more areas, and we included an international author, Stefan Rossner, there, who's a Swedish professor of medicine. And then just in 2017, this new version, which is quite up to date, although it's going to have to be changed every few years, is published in 4 languages in Europe as well as in Australia, and it's doing quite well at the moment. So just to put this in context, when you're trying to find a word or something that gives chronic disease a monocausal focus, so in other words, you're focusing on one cause rather than a whole lot of little causes, and you're not dealing in silos, you're dealing in generalities. One of the things that came out in 1994 was some new findings to show that inflammation didn't just occur, as we've known it has for 2,500 years, as a response to a bacterial or a microbial pathogen or an antigen like this. And you get inflammation, which is like a raging fire that sets the immune defense system on alert. And that then leads, after a couple of weeks, to resolution, which leads you back to basal homeostasis, which is the level state of being, if you like, in health. And it was only in 1994 that some researchers from Harvard came up with a new form of inflammation that they called metaflammation, because it was associated with the metabolic system in the body. And this is not based around a microbial pathogen, but it's based around lifestyle, and it's called an inducer, because there's no one particular thing. Sorry, just said that my internet is unstable. I'm assuming that it's okay. Let me know if it's not. But that inducer then acts through an agent which can be LDL, but it can be other things, that leads on to oxidative stress, metaflammation, insulin resistance, dysmetabolism. And unlike this, which is a raging fire, which lasts for a couple of weeks or maybe even a couple of months at the most, this is more like burning ashes that can go on for years and years. And it causes this dysmetabolism, which is the opposite to metabolism. So instead of homeostasis, you've got allostasis, and then that leads on to chronic diseases. And just about all of the chronic diseases that we are aware of now have this form of inflammation which runs right throughout the body. It's through we thought it was only through the arteries.
Uh-oh. I think we may have just lost him.
No! So we've run out, have we, Darren?
Oh, no, you're back on. I think you dropped out for a moment there, mate.
You didn't pay your bills.
Exactly. Yeah, okay, we're back in business.
Okay. So a couple of us, John Dixon and myself in particular, set out to find out what these lifestyle inducers were. And we knew that they were related to lifestyle, and we had a pretty good suspicion that they were related to all of the things that we suspect in lifestyle. Mind you, the Harvard researchers that came up with this said that they were associated with obesity. And that's probably the reason why obesity causes disease or is associated with disease. I've got to be careful when I talk about causality, which I'll explain to you in just a minute. But they thought that all of these things went through obesity. And if you look at these factors, which we identified as being associated with metaflammation, you can see that over-exercise is not associated with obesity. Smoking is not associated with obesity. Starvation is not associated with obesity. Yet all of these things lead on either through or not through obesity. So obesity may not be necessary to develop metaflammation, but that then leads on to other mechanisms like the oxidative stress and the insulin resistance and so on that I talked about just in a minute, which then can lead on to the chronic non-communicable disease. Now, there can be 10 years between this and this. We know with diabetes, it is roughly 10 years. With type 2 diabetes, you've got about 10 years to turn people around, and you can turn them around, and you can develop increases in insulin through the pancreas, through getting to obesity, getting through to diabetes early enough. I'm involved in a big study at the moment out in Western Sydney where we're trying to do that within the first couple of years of being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Please feel free to ask any questions as we go along. I might just stop there and ask if there's any, because that's probably the most complicated part of the talk that I'm going to give. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Do they come through the audio, Darren?
Yeah, they'll come through. So if anyone got any questions, just unmute yourself and go for it.
No?
All right. It sounds like it's clear as a bell so far. What I will say is that
nobody understands a word of it.
This is some would have already been exposed to some of this information. Okay. For those who haven't, there's a unit we do called physiological underpinnings of chronic disease.
Right.
Look at this stuff in some detail.
Okay. So those things that we've just looked at there, all of these lifestyle-related factors, and some more that I'll come to in a minute, we call anthropogens. And the anthropogens were defined as man-made environments, their byproducts and lifestyles encouraged by these, some of which may be detrimental to human health. We're not saying that all of these are detrimental to human health, and we're not discounting the environments, because in lifestyle medicine, if you don't consider the environment, then you get into victim blaming. And that's what politicians do, and that's what we don't want to be able to do. You can say to people, oh, it's your fault because you're just eating too much and not doing enough exercise and so on. But if you get people who are living in terrible environments, they've got bad social upbringings, bad relationships and so on, then it's not really their fault. It's you've got to come back to look at the environment. And environment has to be part of lifestyle medicine. I don't think some of the other countries are looking at that as much as we are at the moment. I think they should be. So clearly, if a disease is man-made or woman-made, it can be man-prevented or woman-prevented. And that's based on that theory of the anthropogens. Now, what you do in epidemiology, probably the best known epidemiologist in the world is I always forget his name, which is terrible. It's a function of my age. Geoffrey Rose, the English epidemiologist. And he said that you can't just look at the disease. Like in this case, we're looking at type 2 diabetes, coronary heart disease, stroke, cancers, and all these other chronic diseases that I just mentioned before. And their they generally have metaflammation associated with them. Not in the early stages, but later down the track, you have this metaflammation. And you can measure it in the blood. You can measure inflammation through about 35 or 36 different cytokines in the blood. And you can measure short-term changes. So I had a student at Sydney University do this. We compared the effects of eating kangaroo, for example, with eating Wagyu beef, which is a high-fat meat. Kangaroo is a very low-fat, natural meat. And when our people ate the Wagyu beef, their inflammatory markers went up for about 24 hours. But when they ate kangaroo, it didn't go up at all. This was published in the British Medical Journal quite a few years ago, which showed that you can measure these acutely as well as chronically, these inflammatory markers in the body. But as we keep wanting to say Philip James, he's an obesity expert, but it's the British epidemiologist said, you can't just look at the disease, you've got to look at the cause of the cause, you've got to look at the risk factor markers first, and then you look at the determinants. Now, I'm going to use this word determinants rather than causes, because a cause in disease is generally something that you can extract from an organism. The Kuhnian paradigm, developed back in the 1890s, said that if you can extract an organism out of a sick person and inject it into another organism and make that person sick, then you've got proof of the disease. But chronic diseases aren't caused by microorganisms, as we just saw. They're caused by lifestyle factors. And so you've got to look at these determinants. But it's not just the immediate determinants or the proximal or downstream determinants that you've got to look at, because these things like nutrition, activity, drugs and alcohol, they're quite obviously associated with these risk factors and markers, which in turn are quite obviously associated with the diseases, probably through, and it's not definite at this stage, but probably through metaflammation. But people don't eat poorly because they're born with a poor appetite for food, or they don't smoke because they're born with a cigarette in their hand. There are factors that are what we call medial or midstream factors that lead to these proximal or downstream factors. And you'll see that I'm underlining the key letter in a lot of these words here, because that's going to spell out nasty odours in a minute. And epidemiologists love acronyms, something that you can remember when you go back to try and work out what it is that you're dealing with. And then you go even to the upstream causes. So this causes this, this causes this. Can you see my mouse?
Yeah. Yep,
okay. And then this causes this, and this causes the disease, basically. And if you want to deal with the problem, you're only partially dealing with it as doctors do in a clinical practice, by dealing with the risk factors and the markers, unless you're dealing with at least the downstream causes. And at most back here, you're aware of these other factors like the distal or upstream factors, which I've put in inverted commas here, the cause and the cause of the cause and the cause of the cause of the cause, which is what Jeffrey Rose said. You can't just look at the cause. Even in infectious diseases, you've got to look at the cause of the cause and the cause of the cause of the cause. So while we're calling them determinants, I'm using the term cause here loosely. And this, as you can see, you've got N, where's the A? Activity, stress, all of these words spell out nasty odours. And that was what we came up with to start off with. This was about 10 years ago. And we said, well, this is one way of remembering lifestyle factors. Now, again, there are some doctors and some epidemiologists worldwide that say really the only thing that you've got to worry about when you're looking at lifestyle medicine is nutrition, activity, and maybe smoking, and perhaps stress under some occasions. They say that accounts for about 70 to 80% of all chronic diseases. And it does. But when you put all these others into the mix and you consider that each one influences everything else, it's not a linear process. It's a systems model. So as you can see, if you have inadequate sleep, then your nutrition is going to be poor, your physical activity is going to be poor, you're probably more likely to take drugs and alcohol and so on. And that's going to lead on to these factors. So all of these factors interact. So it's totally senseless saying, oh, we only deal with nutrition, activity and smoking because that covers 80% of the problem. It doesn't cover 80% of the problem. It might cover a proportion of that 80%, but unless you're looking at all these other factors, you're not dealing with the problem as a whole. So when you put this into a different form, this is the nasty odours. And you can see nutrition. I'm not going to go into these in detail because we can spend a whole term on each of these, but excess energy, fat, salt and sugar and so on, inactivity, and this is also involves sitting too long. And I should get you up and except I'm getting hungry and I want to go and have dinner. I should get you up and do some exercise now. This is the one that you probably won't understand, the technology-induced pathology, and that means the adverse effects of technology. Every time you get a change in society, you get a change in disease. Now, we've had a major change in the last 30 years in society with the technological revolution. But what's it doing to our health? At the very minor, the very least level, it's having effects on kids through abusing each other on Facebook, for example. And some of you may have seen that show on ABC on sexting and the problems with kids emailing sexual messages to each other. It causes problems with wrists and hands and other problems associated with using computers. But at the larger level, of course, cars are part of technology, and motor vehicle accidents and things like that are also involved in that. And then you've got wars and the weapons that come from wars. Won't go into that in detail. Inadequate sleep is a major one, and that influences a whole lot of other factors. And then the environment, you've got the environment and you've got the environment. The environment is the external environment. The environment is the environment inside you, and particularly associated with microbiotic organisms in the gut, which again is a huge area, a very interesting area, but we're not going to go into that. And then occupation, drugs and alcohol, overexposure to sunlight and radiation, underexposure. These might seem like minor compared to these things, but they're all still important. And these last two are even more important, and they're not really considered quite often in a lot of epidemiology, and that is the relationships people have with each other and social inequality, the ratio between the rich and the poor. We know in countries where the ratio is low between the rich and the poor, health is much better, like in the Scandinavian countries, compared to countries like us and America and Brazil, where you've got a ratio of about 7 or 9 to 1 between the richest tenth of the population and the poorest tenth of the population. We don't know why that's the case, but we've got really good evidence that it is the case. And these stars down here are the level of evidence of metaflammation being associated with each of these factors. 3 stars means that there's a lot of good evidence. 1 star means that the evidence is not as good. So this is only new, technology-induced pathology. We've got some evidence, but not a lot. And then over here, which I can't quite see at the moment because I've got all your pictures, occupation, not a lot of evidence on that, but then drugs and alcohol, overexposure and relationships and so on. A lot of good evidence on those things there. Thanks for putting that the other way around. And then you've got, of course, what we've added, and we added this about 5 years ago. I think I was working in Aboriginal communities out in Western New South Wales, and I've also worked in the South Pacific with Indigenous populations and up in the Torres Strait. And it seemed obvious that a lot of the chronic disease in those communities was resulting not from these physical factors, or it was resulting from the physical factors, nutrition and inactivity and so on. But there are also these other issues, meaninglessness and learned helplessness, alienation from society, and loss of culture and identity. That's the big one for Indigenous cultures. They've lost their culture, and some of the work that I've been doing out there recently is helping them restore their culture and refine their culture. And that's having an enormous success on their health, because the men in particular have lost so much through the loss of their culture, and getting that back together again now is helping them recover their health. So we go back to the determinants then, and this is the one that we had before. And what I've added here is meaninglessness, alienation, and loss of culture and identity. It could go, I don't know, this might be a point for discussion, but whether it goes between the distal and the medial, or whether it is a distal factor or whether it's a medial factor, is open to argument. But I don't think that's the point. I think the point is that we really have to consider it as one of the anthropogens that are involved in chronic disease that lifestyle medicine is meant to deal with. So that spells out nasty malodors. So now what's happened recently is that we've had, in 2009, we had a study come out from the Kaiser Permanente health body in the US that looked at early childhood experiences, or what they've called ACEs, and the fact that about 25% of the American population, they did a large survey of about 36,000 people, about 25% of the population have had adverse childhood experiences. There's a 10-point scale, it's only just come into Australia now, 10-point scale that you can measure on whether you've experienced abuse, either sexual or physical abuse or emotional abuse, whether you've seen parents fighting, all of these different points on a 10-point scale. If you score more than 4, you are classified as having adverse childhood experiences, and adverse childhood experiences lead on later in life to a range of problems, sometimes quite often hidden, because these adverse childhood experiences become subliminal and a lot of people don't realise that they've had them. And in fact, this next book here has only just come out, The Body Keeps the Score. It's written by a psychiatrist, and what he's looking at is not just the ACEs or the early childhood experiences, but the fact that these actually change the structure of the brain. So if you've come across Norman Doidge's book on the brain that changes itself, this fits in with that, because he's saying that the brain changes itself in the first 2 or 3 years, or it can, in the first 2 or 3 years of life. And then you're set in that pattern, which then results in inflammation, which then winds up in chronic diseases, both psychological and physiological, at later life. And so he starts dealing with this within this book about what you can do about it, what sort of thing. And what we're interested in here, Andrew Binns, who's the GP up on the North Coast, who works a lot with Aboriginal people, and myself, we're interested in ways of dealing with this. Andrew, in particular, does art therapy with a lot of Aboriginal men in jails, and they develop a meaning in their life, which is almost like a form of meditation, using dot paintings. You know, the dot paintings where they take years to develop those little dot paintings. And it's like a form of meditation, just sitting there. They do them with matchsticks. So they dip the matchstick, the head of the matchstick, in paint. I've got one on my wall downstairs, and it must have taken 2 or 3 years for the guy to develop it. But he got off drugs and he got into a healthy lifestyle as a result of his artwork. There are other ways of dealing with it too, dealing with these problems, which we're only just starting to develop. So the processes of lifestyle medicine are important. Now, so what I've done here, and this is the first time I've ever shown this, I'm going to show it at a talk that I give on the weekend. You've got all of your anthropogens that I talked about there, the nasty odours. Then you add the nasty malodors to that, and then you add the ACEs to that, which is the adverse childhood experiences. And the adverse childhood experiences can lead to these meaninglessness, alienation, loss of culture, and so on. But they can also directly lead to the other anthropogens, because having these adverse childhood experiences can interfere with your nutrition, with your interest in being physically active, with stress level, with sleep, with all of these other factors. So these all interact with each other, these things. So now we've got to the point where we don't just have the nasty odours, but we've got nasty odours with malice. Now, don't tell me that I've spelt malice wrong, because I know that. But the word that we use in this area is adverse childhood experiences, not inverse childhood experiences. So malice seems to fit in with that. And so you go back to that hierarchy again, and you've got what we had before, and you've got the meaninglessness and not loss of culture and identity. And again, we could discuss this at the end. I've added ACEs here in the distal or the upstream issues, because I think that the environment may cause ACEs, but ACEs may come out of socio-cultural situations and families, and this meaninglessness, loss of culture and alienation that you get. And I use as examples the Aboriginal men who lost their meaning in life because they lost hunting after the British came to Australia. Then they developed another form of meaning when they went to work in shearing sheds, and they were working with farmers in that area. And they've lost that again now because of the automation and the new big farming sort of areas. So they've been through 3 levels of changes in meaninglessness. And, you know, what have they got to do to cover that? If you're living in Walgett, which is where I work, there's not a lot to do apart from drink. And so they drink, and then they become abusive. The women hold the families together, but the men become physically violent as a result of this lack of meaning, alienation, loss of culture. And unless we deal with that, we're not going to deal with the problem. We've got to go back to look at these distal causes to be able to deal with the problem. And that's part of lifestyle medicine. That's the part that you may not have heard about or read about yet, but I think we've got to get into that area. So now we've got nasty odours with malice, and that's what's come out of that. So that's the end for you, as far as I can see, in what I'm going to talk to you tonight about. But I think it's the beginning for lifestyle medicine, because we've only just started to look at these factors that traditional medicine or conventional medicine has never bothered about. A, because doctors aren't trained in that area, but B, because it's such a complicated field to deal with and to manage. But we do work with allied health disciplines, psychologists, for example, and physiotherapists and exercise physiologists and so on, who are trained in this area. And this is another good reason for why the medical system has got to become more involved and more interconnected in an interdisciplinary way with other disciplines. That's me. I'm finished.
That's good stuff, Gary. So, well, everyone's formulating. You happy to stick around for a couple of questions?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Look, for those who, the determinants of chronic disease, there's actually a unit in this course called Determinants of Chronic Disease. And guess what you learn about? It's all that kind of stuff, and we rely very heavily on Gary's work in this space.
Not just my work, but I do have to say, I think we lead the world in this at the moment, because nobody else has come up with that. They're still working on nutrition, inactivity, and smoking, basically. Feet, they call it forks, feet, and fingers. That's all you've got to remember. Yeah, and I agree. And I think that I say, just out of interest, I'll show you really quick. I'm going to share my screen with you. Can you see this one here? Can you see a structured equation model? Yeah.
Right. This is actually a PhD student of mine's just completed. And he did a study looking at the determinants of health of adolescents. And some of the metrics he used were looking at ACEs. And he also looked at childhood family dynamics. And what we found, he did 5 papers for this. And every paper, so this one here was looking at what factors sort of drove or related to, like this one was self-rated health, ACEs comes up. So that was his first paper on page 95, where it is. Where is it? Here's his second paper. This is looking at the mental health status of these students. Same deal. Because for those who are not familiar with structured equation modelling, you put things in that you think would influence that, and then the analyses tell you knock that one out, doesn't have an effect. That one doesn't have an effect. On every one of the studies he did, ACEs was stayed in there, and so did childhood family dynamics. Which what it makes me think, I'll stop sharing there, but I completely agree with you. I think that unless we're looking back, and looking at some people have got really rough starts in life, and I think that whole idea that you spoke about, taking that blame aspect around, I think we need to be a whole lot more understanding about where people are coming from. And when I hear people say that it's physical activity and it's diet, it's just so simplistic, as you alluded to. Anyway, questions. Who's got a question for Gary? You just need to unmute yourself and go for it.
I noticed my old friend Diane Westerway there. I didn't recognise her before, but I can see her name.
How are you, Gary? Looking fit and fabulous as always.
Well, you are. What about me? I didn't know you were doing this course, though.
I'm absolutely thrilled to be doing this course. It's fantastic.
Good, great. Well, you've got a good monitor there, or a good, a mentor through Darren. He's one of the best.
Yes, he's awesome. We love him, don't we?
Di sends me photos of all these exotic hikes she's on, just to make me jealous.
I know, she does. Yeah.
Has anyone got any questions? There's a lot of information to absorb right then, obviously. But Belle, did you look like you just unmuted yourself?
I'm not sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, yay. I just was curious, Gary, in your slide with all of the different types of metaflammation, and I know that you've got different grades of evidence there, but are there any ones in particular which have, I guess, a greater sort of inflammatory response over others?
Nutrition, different aspects of nutrition do.
Yeah.
Particularly, and it's interesting that all of the things that we thought about nutrition, like eating fat, has an acute effect. High levels of fat intake and the wrong types of fat intake have an acute effect as well as a chronic effect. And I'm sure, I've never been able to do this, but if you ever saw that movie Super Size Me, about the guy that ate all the hamburgers, they measured his bloods, but they didn't measure his inflammatory markers because we didn't know about them then. But I'm sure if they've still got his bloods and they went back and measured those, they'd find that his inflammatory markers would be really high. The other one that I find really interesting is over-exercise. And I was talking to Darren before we started this. Apparently, from what I've heard from Guy Leach, there was a girl had a heart attack, 24-year-old girl had a heart attack in the Coolangatta Gold this last weekend. And we're starting to see some of the triathletes that do extremely long distances every 2 weeks. They travel around the world and do it. They're as badly off as people who don't exercise at all. There's a lot of heart problems. Darren Mercer was another one that had problems. Guy himself has had a few problems like that as well. So it's surprising that, you know, life seems to be based around a U-shaped curve. You can get too much of things and not enough of things. And the cue is to get the right amount. And that differs between different individuals too. In terms of evidence-based, again, sleep. The relationships and the social inequity, people who are living in a socially inequitable situation tend to have higher natural inflammatory markers than those who don't. So the amazing part about it is this hasn't been picked up much in the general literature as yet. We started publishing stuff on it in about 2008 or 2010, I think it was. And everything that I've done, I'm old enough to realise now that it takes about 10 years for this to seep in. And nobody's interested in what I write, and you tend to become disillusioned and want to go out and just surf and don't bother about doing this sort of stuff. But it catches up with you, so that in 10 years' time, they start saying, oh, that was good. Boyd and I wrote a paper in 2006 in the British Medical Journal, and it was the first paper to look at the ecological effects on the ecological causes of obesity. It wasn't quoted at all for the first 10 years. And then in 2010, it won an award for one of the I think it was the best 12 nutritional papers published in that year. And it's now quoted really highly. So it's got a lot of citations. So you know, you think that science works quickly. It doesn't. It does in some areas where you've got a medication that somebody wants to sell, but not in a lot of other areas.
Anyone else got a question? Why are you so quiet tonight? I can't believe you've just been here. You're stargazed or something or other.
Or asleep.
Hi, Gary.
Sorry?
Hi, Gary.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you. Thank you so much for zooming in with us tonight.
You're welcome.
I think what you've spoken about, it's a little bit shocking in the sense that we thought that medications were the problem and we could fix the world by fixing diet and exercise. I guess what you've shared is that the problem is going to take a whole lot more heroism than we can do just by fixing people's lifestyle, at least the end result as to what we thought the determinants were. So just looking at the data and what you've shared tonight and what we're doing through this subject as well, currently, it's a lot harder than we first thought, and we're potentially a lot less useful than we first thought because we can't fix.
I don't think you're a lot less useful. I think that you're at the forefront of what's happening at the moment. A really good example of that is at the moment is climate change. And when I said that you have to look at the environment to deal with other issues, personal issues, climate change and obesity are very closely related. I've done a fair amount of work on this. If you think about it, if people eat the wrong foods and they're driving cars around burning petrol and so on, they're not only going to get fat, but the world is going to get fat, or the Gaia, the world's atmosphere is going to get fat with carbon, and that's going to lead on to things like climate change. So that's why I say with lifestyle medicine, I believe that climate change is something that we've got to deal with, and we've got to be very open about dealing with. Up until now, we haven't, because we've been struggling to get recognised just in the area of lifestyle, individual lifestyle. But it's a real mistake, as some of the politicians try to make it sound, that it's just an individual problem. All you've got to do, I think it was Barnaby Joyce said, it's easy to deal with obesity. All you've got to do is push your table back, not eat the food on the table. But it's much more difficult than that.
I think it's really interesting just to see the bigger picture, and it really shifts the blame game away from such a simplistic approach. Thank you.
Anyone else got any other questions before we let Gary go to dinner? He said he's hungry.
Hi, this is Camila here. I have a quick question. So I was fascinated with one of the papers that Gary wrote, and I don't recall the exact.
Sorry, you just cut out there.
But Gary, it was one that talked about food consumption.
So just cut out again.
Yeah, it talked about. Oh, can you hear me? Oh,
I think there's somebody.
I'm on my earphones.
Yeah, he seemed to dropped in and out just at the critical times there. Can you have one more try?
Can you? Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay, so it was about the paper, the consumption in Australia, and impacts of economical impacts. And I wanted to know if, with the whole trend of veganism and a lot of people following a plant-based diet, what if this movement of lifestyle medicine and plant-based diet actually grew? What would be the impacts of that? Because it looks from your paper that it was already going to be very challenging to keep it up if everyone, like with the current consumption, a bit of it was at risk continuing producing equivalent amounts of vegetables and fruits.
I missed the last bit about the vegetables and fruits, but if I can try and answer what I think I heard before, that it's virtually too difficult to deal with the problem when you take it back to the distal roots, because the distal roots become political and social and so on. Unfortunately, I think that there's no solution to that. I think that we've got to do that. Jeffrey Rose always said that all health is political, comes down to politics in the end. And that doesn't mean that it has to be one side of politics or the other, but it comes down to politics. And I think what we're seeing with the climate change stuff at the moment is a good example of that. We've got the reaction against climate change, which is, I remember vividly, occurred in smoking. I've been through about 4 of these in my lifetime with the deniers who said, it took a long, long time for people to admit that smoking and cancer were related. But now everybody accepts it. Mahatma Gandhi always said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. That's the stages of change that occur in these sorts of situations. And I think we should be involved in that. We shouldn't just be stuck at the proximal end of dealing with problems. We've got to be back at the distal, or at least at the medial end of dealing with those, and then working with people who are going to be doing things at the other end.
All right, I think we've got time for one last question. If someone's got a burning desire, now's your moment.
Hi.
Go, Georgia.
Yep.
Hi, Gary. It's Georgia here. Pleased to meet you on Zoom.
Yep.
I remember you from one of from my first gym instructors course, which I did in Sydney, and it was run by yourself, Nigel Champion, and Rosemary Stanton. So. Yep. Yeah, it goes back a long time. But anyway, so nice to speak to you again. Look, just going back to what you were saying about it takes 10 years to change anything. I guess a little bit off track of what we've been talking about. I've heard Darren say that in the space of lifestyle medicine that it's being, rather than it being driven from the top to the bottom, it's being driven from the bottom up. Yeah. And from my point of view, I don't necessarily think that's that's a good way of doing it, because it's too slow. And so what I've noticed, you know, we all go to the polls, we vote, and our votes are affected by how we're marketed. And so I'm just wondering what can happen in lifestyle medicine to market it so that things like shared appointments just become the norm, and that anyone chronically ill can join those. Because it just seems to me that we need high-profile people in your space, such as yourself and Darren and others, to push it. So I know Darren's been on Studio 10, and I think he needs to go back on there to push this myself. But what are your thoughts about the marketing and making it general knowledge to people?
Well, I think it's now up to people like Darren, because Darren's got the youth on his side, and he's a very good speaker, and people listen to him. So we need more of Darren's around. I've probably done my time there, and it hasn't. Well, I've had some successes. I think we had enormous success with smoking. But see, the changes that occurred in the time that I've been involved in health, which is nearly 50 years, have occurred quite slowly, and they happen at an exponential rate. They start off really slowly, and then you get what's called a black swan event. Something happens that changes people's thinking all of a sudden, and all of a sudden you get changes. And the general view is that in the community, that you need about 20% of the population to form a positive view about something before you get change in society. We're just seeing that now with climate change, which is, I'm not using that as the only example of related to health, but it's a good example of it because it started off so slowly. It was back in the 1960s when we first talked about climate change. In fact, the oil companies talked about it back in the 60s, but it didn't start to take off. It's only really just started to take off in the last few years. And now we're starting to see an exponential growth. Maybe I shouldn't say this on Open TV, or Open Zoom, but I think the Extinction Rebellion people that are out there at the moment are doing a fantastic job in creating an awareness. But they couldn't have done that 10 years ago. They would have been hounded out of town. But at the moment, the politicians are struggling to find a response to them. They're all saying that this is irresponsible and, it's holding up people and stopping people. But they're coming up with some very clever ideas. One of the ones that you didn't see, Di, I don't know whether you saw it, down at Manly Beach the other day, they dug holes in the sand and all stuck their heads in the sand. And the media didn't cover it for some reason. I thought it was a great bit of media to have these people with their ostriches on their heads in the sand. And they're coming up with some interesting ideas. So in answer to your question, it was a long answer, but I think things are happening faster today than they ever have before. Exponential growth is much, for better and for worse, is happening much faster. And so when you get a black swan event, and a black swan, as you recall, the English called these things that happen that change the course of the world black swans, because when they came to Australia, there weren't any black swans in Europe, in the Northern Hemisphere. You only get them in Australia. So they thought that things were happening that were totally different down here. So they talk about this as a black swan event. And when you get a black swan event, that changes everybody's thinking overnight, basically. And I think that we're getting to the stage where that's going to happen. I mean, we're seeing so much disruption in the world at the moment that we've got to come out of it, or we're all in trouble somehow.
Yeah. Good. Hey, I think we're going to wrap it up there so that Gary doesn't grow faint. But I've heard Gary present. Man, I don't know how many times at conferences and the like, and every time I learn new information. And what I love about Gary is just so progressive in what he's thinking and what he's presenting. So, mate, I just really want to thank you for joining us tonight. It's a real honour for the group, and want to encourage you to keep up the good fights. You've had an incredible legacy in terms of the impact that you've had in Australia, and I know that you're going to continue to do that into the future. So, so thank you for being part of it with us tonight. And I think you guys, just talking to everyone in the group now, it's a real honour to have Gary with us. So
great to see such a good little group.
Yeah, it's look, we've got, I always say this, that lifestyle medicine, that space attracts my favourite kind of people, and they're capable, caring, passionate people, and they want to make a difference in the world. And anytime you're rubbing shoulders with those kind of characters, it's happy days. So Yeah, and and for that reason, this is why I often encourage people to get along to the conferences. I know so many people that will go to an ASLM conference. They might be have gone to other conferences in their various disciplines, and then they just come away going, "This is like nothing I've ever been at." There's a real air of we're making a difference here. We're impacting the world. So yeah, you're all part of it. There's a lot of work to do, but the battle can be won, like Mahatma Gandhi said. So Gary, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Gary.
Yeah.
Thank you.